right, hello and welcome. So this is already off to a good start because we are competing against ChatGPT on the first conference room, and we have a full house, so go humans. So it's a pleasure to be here. We have a super high caliber panel which will introduce themselves very soon. I mean, we have lots of experts in the audience as well, so we'll make room for Q&A the last 10-15 minutes. And please ask all the hard questions, that's the whole point. And we were just chatting before we started here, and we're already disagreeing. So it's great. I mean, I expect this will be a very lively and interesting panel. So to kick things off, let's just do a really quick round of introductions. My name is Pedro Vasconcellos. I'm with Pearson Ventures, is the corporate venture capital arm of Pearson, the learning company. And Karie, you can start on this side.
Karie Willyerd, and I'm a 6-time Chief Learning Officer, now head of customer strategy at Learning Technologies Group.
Elizabeth Barisik. I lead strategic partnerships at Degreed, which is an upskilling platform.
My name is Dan Hopkins. I'm the VP of Applied AI and Global Public Sector for Eightfold.ai.
All right, Andreas, one of the co-founders and CEO at TechWolf, a Belgian startup, and we help large enterprises build and maintain skill taxonomies.
And I'm Peter Fox. I'm the head of operations and technology learning for Citibank.
Very good. So just so that we have a good view of who's who and what the audience is composed of, who's a founder? Who's in a startup? Okay, good. Who is an investor? Okay, and who is in the corporate space, like chief learning officer, HR? I mean, not only the C people, but in that space. Who's everyone else? Like in academia, maybe? Yeah? Okay. Okay, good. Yeah, we missed a lot of people. We tried to do 3 categories, didn't quite work. Very good. So to kick things off, I think what we wanted to do is to start with some definitions. So, Karie, can you kind of give us the definition? Taxonomy, ontology, because everyone disagrees. We were disagreeing early. How would you explain that, just to kick things off?
I thought this would be an easy question, and even ChatGPT would keep giving me different answers as well when I tried to define, because it turns out there's definitions for in software development, and then there's definitions in skills. So the question is ontology, taxonomy, and I decided to revert to a little bit easier assumption, which is we want to know what jobs require or what performance requires in order to fulfill the mission of an organization. So we want to know, what do people need to do? And so we structure into taxonomies, which tend to be hierarchical and discipline-based. And there are entire libraries. I know, having implemented Degreed at Visa, we used 42,000 from Degreed. And ontology is more relationship-oriented. So I sort of think of it as how skills are related. When EDS, one of the companies bought by IBM, first was building systems analysts in the late 80s, early 90s, there weren't enough graduates in systems analysis. So they found that, hey, it turns out that programming skills are and system analyst skills are very related to musical skills. And so they started hiring people with musical ability to train to become systems analysts. So I think of a ontology, and I know I just can't even look at my panelists, co-panelists, because I'm afraid they're going to be frowning at everything I say here. I think of an ontology as a hashtag. So, in a taxonomy, it's very structured and one builds to another, whereas an ontology is very relationship-oriented. And now I'll look at my panelists and see what they think.
Anyone wants to comment or disagree?
Yeah, I can chip in. So for me, there's like maybe an extra layer, and that's the vocabulary, and that's kind of like all of the atoms. If you add a little bit of structure relationships between those, then you have the ontology. And for me, a taxonomy it adds hierarchy and it adds a selection. So if you, for example, if you're an enterprise, you want to develop a skill taxonomy, then from a list of skills, you, make a selection of the ones that you want to have. You add hierarchy so that you can report on a high level, but that you have the right level of granularity. And that's, for me, the difference between a taxonomy and ontology.
All right. Okay, so the topic of the panel is, so skills, skills, skills. Are we moving towards like the unified global taxonomy? And funnily enough, when I was kind of preparing the panel with these distinguished panelists, pretty much everyone said, you know what, different contexts require different taxonomies, and maybe that's very hard to implement, etc. And you're very vocal about this, Andreas. So are we in the wrong panel? Should we be advocating against it because it's a bad thing to have a unified taxonomy? Would it be too, I don't know, too stiff?
Yeah, I think we might have the wrong panel title for sure. So a lot of the things around the global skill taxonomy, it comes from the World Economic Forum, and I feel like there's a little bit of misinterpretation there. So a taxonomy, it ties to a specific set of data, and then it ties into use cases. So like, what do we want to structure, and what do we want to do with that? And for the World Economic Forum, and we're part of the steering committee, so we try to, to be a sounding board there. They try to, structure data across the entire labor market, across economies, across continents, and provide high-level analysis on that data, give high-level insights. So their global taxonomy makes a lot of sense because it's fit for purpose. But if you're an enterprise learning leader or enterprise HR leader, then you have a different set of use cases and you have different data points. So then it makes a lot more sense to restrict the skills to, the skills that you have in your organization, and then perhaps the skills that you want to acquire as an organization, so that you have the right amount of granularity, but that is still manageable. So I think instead of trying to have one taxonomy that fixes everything, I think it's about finding the minimum viable taxonomy almost for your specific use case, and not being too bothered with how it ties into a global standard.
But would you pull that from the World Economic Forum? So would you still have a consistent top level and then recommend organizations draw from that, or would you create separate ones again?
I would probably create separate ones, because I think if you're a very specific organization, that the World Economic Forum one, it will never have the granularity that you need, because they try to, it's always a balance between keeping it manageable and making sure it's complete so that it covers the entire data set. If you're a bank, or if you're a leader in bank, then, it's just a very small fraction of the skills that you actually need. So I would just bring your own hierarchy.
I want to chip in here into the conversation, and I think from my experience in talking with clients and talking with other people in the industry that we get very, very focused on the taxonomy itself, which in some ways is a solution to a problem. But if we level it up and we think about what is the actual problem that we're looking to solve, I think that's a good place to start. And one thing that I want to say is that a skills taxonomy is not a skills strategy. I hear this from clients all the time. We need our taxonomy before we can do anything with skills. And that couldn't be further from the truth, right? The reason why we're here today on this panel talking about skills is because we know there's something there to unlock a different world of work. But we're paralyzed, or I see clients paralyzed very regularly because it just feels overwhelming. They've either spent tremendous resources in-house to try to develop their own, and then we're back in this vicious cycle of competency models that are always changing and never done. And so I think really focusing on, what is actionable, how to get started with skills, how to identify the core things that are important to your organization. Start moving. It's not, perfect is the enemy of done. And so I think Andreas's point about, we need to get something in place and working and not worry about the global standard is important to point out.
That's a really good point. Yeah. Then, looking at it in practice, what are the challenges? Why is it that we're here and still, why haven't happened yet?
Sure. Yeah. So what I see in our private sector business quite a bit is that agile organizations really require agile talent and an agile understanding of that talent. And the challenge with taxonomies is they're fairly static, and they're really incredibly time intensive to create. usually require consultants to come in to spend almost 2 years to build that static ontology. And let's just assume for a moment that you can capture all the skills that are required within your organization. Typically, they'll lack context and they become outdated very quickly, especially in today's world, right? Where the half-life of skills is increasing, where there's a lot of new skills that are being required. Organizations are changing dramatically. Their go-to-market, their customers are demanding more and more. And so the challenge with a taxonomy is that you basically fix that in a moment in time, and it requires a lot of effort to get you there. And that you need a taxonomy. I'm not saying that you should throw the taxonomies out, because in a lot of ways, how you look at your employees, how you judge their progress and success, you need to have that baseline. But I don't think it's too much of a dishonest analogy to look at sort of taxonomies of today as like, and I might be dating myself a little bit, if you go back and remember when search first came on the internet, when you had AOL or Yahoo, and you had to go through the categories to find what it was that you were looking for, and that really wasn't super valuable. Like, you could get there, but it was somewhat dependent on somebody going through and making decisions. And then Google came along and said, hey, look, we can do a lot with unstructured data, and we can also understand intent and personalization to get you the results that you need. So I think that the taxonomy of the future and the real opportunity that we have here is to be able to leverage data to inform that moment in time for those taxonomies, to be able to give you the most complete and accurate picture and view of the skills that your organization needs, and more importantly, where the market's coming. And so I think that if you do that sort of in a vacuum, or you disambiguate the two, then it can be a real challenge when you only think about structuring a taxonomy as sort of a silo or a moment in time.
All right, yeah. I mean, it begs the question, are we moving towards a future where, in a few years, you just press a button on ChatGPT and it comes up with today's taxonomy? Right? Because, to kind of just scan whatever's out there, and, and then everyone out here will be out of a job, or out here too. And it gives you the taxonomy of today, and you refer to that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I don't want to take away from the other conference that's going on, or the other room about ChatGPT. But ChatGPT is, it's trained off of a lot of data, and really the only purpose of ChatGPT is to give you the next logical word in a sentence structure. And so the content that it gives you looks like plausible, right? It looks like okay, well, that seems pretty interesting and reasonable. And us humans, when we see something that's structured in a language that we can understand, like, we can buy that. But unfortunately, it has no relationship to the actual truth. So in a lot of ways, it's just sort of a BS engine in some ways, right? Because it's trained on all this data, and it doesn't really know if it's giving you anything accurate. So to answer the question of if it should drive a taxonomy, I don't think the answer to that is clearly no, especially if you are responsible for the outcomes that it creates. I think we get to a world in which you can start to align those models specifically to your organization, which is where the reinforcement learning, human feedback comes in, and that's the opportunity, I think, where you can bring in your own data to those organizations to train. Because the reality is that you're sitting in your HRS systems on a ton of data already. So it's how to make sense of that data, how to contextualize that in a global perspective of what's happening outside of your organization, but hyper-contextualize those outcomes to you. And so while ChatGPT is super interesting for sure, I don't think it's fit for purpose for your internal organization, but those concepts of large language models along with reinforcement learning for your objective function can be compelling in the future.
All right. So going back to the kind of the topic of the session, right? Are we moving towards a global unified taxonomy? So if you step back and then you look at other examples where it was successfully implemented, there is a taxonomy that is accepted widely. Peter, question to you, this one. So if you go to the world of chemistry, right, you have the periodic table of the elements, you have unpack is the pattern, and how you call a molecule, there's no discussion. There's rules around it, how you call a molecule. And same thing for biology, same thing for many, many other things where NGOs or committees have actually agreed and kind of reached a point where they say, this is how you're going to do it. And then it's very standardized and it works really well. And it's always non-profit, right? So should we all here, including those two guys, those three people here, who are in the private enterprise, should we all be kind of open sourcing our models and agreeing on kind of the widest reaching, the furthest reaching way of kind of open sourcing everything so that we can all agree? We're all referring to the same data.
I think that if you'd asked me that question a few years ago, I would have started by saying, yes, definitely, we should get our foundation right and agree. I think that the way that we can handle unstructured data has made getting that foundation consistent less important than it was in the past.
He just disagreed that managing large amounts of data with AI works.
Well, I'm not sure that you necessarily disagreed. I think that you said that the way ChatGPT is doing it is different. I think we come back to the actual idea of having a shared taxonomy. I would say that just understanding whatever the skills are, and stay with banking, because that's obviously what I know, I think that solving the taxonomy is less important than being able to correctly measure the skill that makes up that taxonomy. So by that I mean, it's one thing for us to have a list of skills that we say people would have, but having a consistent way of measuring those skills, given that different skills get measured in different ways, I think that's the real wall that we hit.
Before we go into measuring, Andreas.
Yeah, maybe to on the question itself, where you gave examples from, like maybe the medical industry where you have certain codes for certain diseases, or in chemistry where you have, well, obviously a shared lexicon for all the atoms. I think that's exactly the context, like as part of like the context and the use cases, that is the same for all those companies in that case, but is not true for skills. So hydrogen will be hydrogen in all of these situations, but project management, for example, if you're trying to build the Eiffel Tower, it's very different from if you're trying to build a software application or trying to do something else. So even like very niche and well-defined skills can mean different things for different people in different organizations. So I think that's exactly the reason why it works in some industries across the world, but why we haven't been able to figure it out here.
It's a good point, yeah. Maybe it's not an exact science. That's why you can't put it in a box and it will stay in the box forever. Yeah. So Peter, your point about measurement is really interesting, right? I mean, it's one thing to agree, okay, this is project management. It's a very different thing to say you are 4 out of 10 in project management. And even a 4 in what? In knowing about project management? Or
Exactly, yeah, we discussed this. This is really true. Like, did I take a Udemy course on project management, or have I successfully run a $50 million project as the PM? And there's a big difference between that, between just having consumed something and we now tag and say you have that skill, versus having to successfully actually experienced it, applied it in different environments. So having a way of keeping a consistent measurement is, I think, the biggest challenge, because we measure things differently depending on what the skill is that we're trying to do. And I think that ties back to what you're saying, Andreas. And I think it's what Elizabeth alluded to earlier.
Yeah, I'm curious about the practical experience in the panel of solving for that. Elizabeth.
I'm sorry, it is so loud. I can barely hear what
measurement, in the measurement of skills. So I mean, it's one thing to say, okay, the person has project management skills. What does it mean that the person is a 4 out of 10? Or can you do that? Yeah.
Well, you can do that, and you could even sort of reconcile different measurements to mean, you know, sort of similar things in similar systems. But I think, again, it gets back to the, you know, what are we going to do with that information, right? And keeping it grounded. And I can say that in my experience, skills measurement has been about a couple of different things, right? It's about knowing what learning to push to what person at what level so they can consume it. But in that, in and of itself, there's some assumptions made that, well, then we can level content, and that we can level content for the right person, because a certain level with one person with one set of skills might mean that they can learn something more quickly than somebody else with another set of skills, right? So I think it really, again, comes back to sort of the why. What are the things that we're solving for? What's the job to be done, right, in product speak? And how do we sort of adapt to that particular use case? I don't know of a sort of a universal acceptable way to say it means the same thing in every single context, because even with a taxonomy, the words that we're using, even if we agree that this word means this thing, even within my own business, that word can mean something different for a different person in a different role in a different department.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. You know, I think that oftentimes when, let me say this, I don't think employees within an organization really care about your skills ontology, and they really don't want to necessarily fit in the box in which you've defined. What they really care about is, are they being recognized for their skills? Are they on a development path? Are they making sure that they're relevant to be useful within the organization and have that kind of feedback? And so I think the more that you can move, like, again, taxonomies you always have to have. But in terms of like enabling outcomes, I think the more important thing is to contextualize that based off of that specific individual and the specific task at hand. And the real way that you only are able to do that is to really look at the requirement for that specific job in that specific industry at that specific company. Because even if you go to like, okay, we're a bank or we're a software company, well, within that, you might be producing the exact same product, but you're competing on different ends of the value stick, right? And then you can double click into that specific role, and the skills that are required for that role are much different. If you can compare that then to the individual's capabilities, their existing baseline, and through technologies like artificial intelligence, you can start to map skills adjacencies. If somebody knows skill A, might they learn skill B? Could they learn skill C and what velocity? Then what you're doing is on an individual to an opportunity basis, whether it's a job or a project, is that you're able to match in real time those skills to fulfill your internal demand. And I think that's ultimately sort of really the golden outcome that most organizations really need to implement to become nimble within their organization and make sure that they're staying relevant with their employees.
It's really
Can I
loud.
add
Yeah,
to that?
go ahead.
I because most of us in the room are actively involved in development, I think we're missing another component of this, and that is skills-based hiring. So I think skills-based hiring is just as interesting to organizations now for a few reasons. There are some large capability areas that we just don't have enough human beings able to do. Cloud computing, nursing, truck driving, and I could keep on going with a list, data science, and so on. So we're trying to find out the skills adjacency problem, not only to develop people inside, but to look for what we could get from outside. And the second reason is we know graduation rates out of college are low compared to the number of jobs we need if ChatGPT doesn't take away all our jobs. But if there are jobs to be had at the same rate that they are now, we need to be able to figure out ways to have a proxy other than the degree for whether people have the skills they need to
Someone is agreeing with you already.
Yeah.
Carry on.
Yeah, well, and so I think my main point is that I think skills are not just for, they're for providing inclusivity and access to jobs as well, and I think that's an important destination for us to co-consider when we are thinking about development.
So a lot of the conversation you guys, everyone is noticing is around data, right? So we are processing the data and working with the data, clean up the data, making sense of the data. What about, you and I had a good conversation, all the people, all the individuals, all the employees, workers whose skills or whose knowledge is not captured in the data, like blue-collar jobs, self-employed, man and van, all those things. How can we extend this conversation about skills taxonomies to include them?
Well, I think it's even bigger than that. Who in the room feels like the job that they're in takes advantage of every single skill they have? Probably no one, because you've got other skills that aren't necessarily demonstrated in your role or couldn't be captured in your role. So in a sense, we're all disadvantaged because who we are as humans isn't necessarily captured in the constraint of a job or a role that we have.
Comments there? No? Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
I'll just add, on the inclusivity part, it's incredibly important. Most organizations, when they build these skills taxonomies and when they hire in general, if let's say they're looking for a data scientist, typically what they'll look for is just other people that have that existing job title. They don't really look at the skills of that individual, which means that you're now competing for other data scientists that everybody else wants, and you're either going to have to pay them more money to come to your organization, or it might not be necessarily the individual that you want. But turns out there's a whole bunch of individuals that actually have the skills and capabilities that you're looking for that might not necessarily have that title. and that may be even on a career trajectory to get there. And so when you start evaluating candidates based off of skills and capabilities as it relates to the role within your organization, you're not only casting a wider net for talent, you're also really giving individuals that big break that they need to often move into that wage or move into that position. And in a public sector use case, that can really mean the difference between family sustaining wages to be able to consider those individuals based off of skills, not just of titles of that individual. So it's really critical to understand those capabilities and those skill sets and the potential of that individual.
But if there are multiple taxonomies, to Andreas' point, how can I, the individual, move from job to job carrying my credentials in a way that everyone understands? In a way that I say, okay, I've achieved this in company A, and I want to move to company B. Oh, too bad, they use a different taxonomy.
Yeah, that's not possible today.
I disagree.
Yeah, well, and I think like it should be possible one day, but when you look at the reality, and I think, I'm not sure if it's on this floor, but like the paper ceiling artwork, today there is very limited trust in data on skills, to the point where like you can work in an organization for 15 years, you can be up for promotion to become a VP, and somebody might still ask like, are we sure she's capable of being a VP? Like she doesn't have a master's degree. So people disregard 15 years of work to fall back to like this piece of paper. So it's not like, to me personally, it's not about technological capability, because I think there is technological capability that with access to the data, and that's something else with all of the red tape and the privacy. But technologically, this could happen. But today it just doesn't, and the trust is just not there. The only trusted thing today, to me, is in many places, is just a college degree.
I think that's we were in a meeting yesterday, and someone from, I guess maybe I should just say, one of the largest retailers in the world, and the largest retailer in the world, and he was saying that they deconstructed the role of a first-line manager, and they were trying to not have the job be defined by or require a bachelor's degree, and the managers, the people that were writing finally gave up and just said, we don't. The reason we really need people who have a degree is because they'll show up to work. And by going to college, they ended up showing up to work. And I don't know how that would be captured in a skills taxonomy, or on, like how would you get to it? But that is one of the things that was their problem, is they used the degree as a proxy for, you're disciplined enough to come to a class and finish something.
I mean, unrelated comment, but this is really interesting, because I was looking, for a different project, I was looking at curriculum for vocational courses in Europe. It's not a big thing in the US, unfortunately. In the UK, Germany, it's much bigger. And most of the very basic levels, the entry-level courses, like the first 6 months, one of the disciplines you learn is time management for across the board, which, to your point, right? I mean, you don't need to go to college for that. It could be a vocational, something that you learn, yeah. All right, so should we open up for questions from the floor? Yeah, there's a microphone somewhere, right? There you go. Who's going to be the first volunteer?
Hi, Bror Saxberg. I'm a learning engineer. When you look at the cognitive science on expertise, unpacking how top performers decide and do things is kind of a tricky business. 70% of it is often tacit or non-conscious after a decade or more of work, and it is very discipline specific. And so those kinds of definitions, those gold standard definitions that come out of those interview processes, give you blueprints for training, blueprints for hiring, that you can tie back to top performers. How do you link taxonomies to that kind of by hand yet still evidence-grounded documentation of what top performers actually decide and do?
Anyone want to take this? No volunteers?
That sounds like a veteran question. So I'm a rookie.
Is it reflected in it?
So we could take I'll go completely contrarian and ask, are we doing the right thing by trying to quantify all of this? Because I think we tried to do this with competencies. Now, we're doing it with skills as well. So you're kind of taking the argument of it's so difficult to tease out performance. But I think there's evidence of performance. So rather than that assumption that you started with is how do we get it out of their head, when perhaps there's clues and evidence in how they work, and especially with the capabilities of artificial intelligence, the ability to figure that out without necessarily having to have somebody come with it out of their head.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, going beyond skills, context of those skills matter quite a bit. Oftentimes, organizations can be measures of proxies, for instance, and roles and job titles. There are a number of other dimensions, just associations, papers, that kind of stuff, where you can start to gain context. At a senior level position, you might check a lot of the boxes, but at the end of the day, right, there's a human that still needs to make the best decision on that individual. And so I think the opportunity for technology is to be assistive into that process, to surface all that information to that individual, to allow that human in the loop to make that proper decision. And I think today one of the big limitations are, the reality is most people actually don't get screened in a process, they get filtered out. And so how do you actually make sure that an individual has a fair evaluation? And oftentimes the tools that are leveraged today are just looking at their resume. Well, it turns out resumes are a poor articulation of potential. They're historical looking, and they also are self-attested. And oftentimes an individual might be limited based on their ability on how to sell themselves. And so technology provides an opportunity to really validate those skills in context with a number of different dimensions. And one of those might be like, hey, I worked on a project with the best AI person. And so there can be an associative inference of knowledge transference, if you will, where you start to get that proxy measure. But ultimately, when you can infer a set of skill sets for an individual, you have a more complete picture of that individual. And so at the end of the day, what your really main objective is to make sure that the people that should be getting evaluated are getting evaluated and not just filtered out based off of a keyword search.
Elizabeth had a comment as well.
Oh, yeah. Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, I think we had this conversation this morning called Skillapalooza, and one of the things that people were talking about is that the downside of generative AI for identifying and inferring from a lot of people who do this tend to do this or like this, is we could have regression to the mean as well. And so that is that, because we're looking for commonality, and is commonality the enemy of inclusivity at times? So.
Yeah, so I saw we have got 7 minutes left, and I felt like they told us to be controversial on this panel. And so I think it goes to say that, I think the problem with skills taxonomies is that they're incredibly boring, right? It's so boring. But in a lot of cases, it's because those are abstract. And to make it a little bit more concrete, there's a podcast that I listen to. If anybody's heard of it, it's called Acquired. It's amazing. And they tell a story very frequently that Jeff Bezos shared about breweries in Europe at the turn of the century. And at the turn of the century, electricity had just been invented. And the breweries took this new technology, and they were able to just incredibly, increase the quality of the beer, the output of the beer, but they had to create their own power, right? They had their own power generators, which is incredibly capital intensive. Well, along come utility companies, however many years later, and this new generation of breweries starts renting their power from the electric company. So they, dramatically had lower costs, and they ended up beating this first generation of breweries that had created their own power. And so the lesson there is, focus on what makes your beer taste better. And so I think if we apply that case to learning, how do we focus on what makes our beer taste better, right? There's so many providers that are out there today solving these problems, doing an incredible job. But what do we in our companies care about, right? How do we start to engage individuals so that they're using our system, so that we're creating more data, so that we know more about their skills in real time, right? I call that systems of engagement, and the only way that we're going to be collecting more information about the skills that people have and helping them upskill is by getting them to use the systems we've created. So that's a very user-centric experience. It's something where the value is apparent to them immediately, right? And people care about their careers. They care about economic opportunity. And I think what the interesting thing about being here at GSV and having this juxtaposition of workforce learning and K-12 learning is that by helping increase economic opportunity through skills for families, we also have a greater chance of increasing educational outcomes for children, because we know that socioeconomic status is tied to educational outcomes. So that's what I want to share.
Very good point. We have 5 more minutes. Let's continue to take questions. And they're in the middle.
Thank you for the panel. This is maybe more of a comment than a question, but there is a question in there. I'm surprised that job simulations haven't come up in this conversation, because in my company, we're a startup, we're very agile, and in the time that it would take to figure out what skills, I think you mentioned something about a half-life of skills is increasing, and that's certainly the case for my work. So what we do is we take the hardest problem that we're facing right now, turn it into a job simulation, put it in front of candidates, and whoever demonstrates the problem-solving skills in the moment, and then you can kind of train around the edges. How would you do this with a team? How would you do this with a problematic customer? And then from there, we can suss out, who has the skills that we really can't define or maybe put into a taxonomy, but it passes the sniff test. Like, we know they're good at solving the problem. And I think for companies where the skills are static and they're not going to change a lot over time, building a taxonomy makes sense. But in the startup world, we need to know, can you solve today's problem? Because for me, my job title has changed at my company. I've been there seven years, and it's changed 6 times. And so I've had to adapt. And the way we do that and the way I hire teams and advisors is, here's the hardest problem, respond to it. And I just have to be smart enough to know that they're getting at what I think is the solution. So I guess the question under there is, can job simulations and problem solving kind of replace this entire model?
Well, I started my career in pilot training and in nuclear power simulation training, so designing for a multi-million-dollar simulator. We'd program in what happened at 3 Mile Island and see how people reacted. So I think it depends on the complexity of the skills, whether you can do a job simulation. You wouldn't necessarily, some skills take so much combination of things, it's difficult to see in an easy simulation. But you do bring up a good point that simulations are one way to evaluate for hiring and to evaluate for development. They can be, for some jobs, very, very complex to develop.
Question here. That's probably the last one. Yeah. Here in the middle.
Hi, thank you for the panel. I'm just thinking skills, we may need to unpack a little bit, because I'm thinking, skills and skills sometimes are different things, in the sense some skills are fundamental, more generic, kind of first principle skills. As you can see, for the most part, workplace that critical thinking, analytical skills, people skills, time management, resilience, being comfortable with unfamiliar, uncertainties and so on. Those are core skills. I think it would be well suited for taxonomies. And then there are other skills which are more domain or task specific, relate to industries and so on. So I think, to think skill with a little bit more granularity and kind of there's some fundamental core of it. I think that will really helps to, first of all, obviously it is important to have that common language for communication across sectors, transferring jobs and so on. So my question is thoughts on more of a fundamental, generic, first principle skill taxonomy.
Thank you. I mean, I can give a short answer to that one because we're at time. So I think sort of where we landed here was that, I think there will be, I think we're moving towards a global taxonomy because there are lots of NGOs, lots of open source taxonomies out there. They are getting faster and faster and probably converging. But I think in practice, I think the implementation requires a lot of specificity to the context, specificity to the individual, to the specific ways of measuring in the job description, in the context. So I think we'll always have to accept that you have the periodic table, of the commonly accepted ways of describing skills, but then when you double click on each specific application, you will have specificities and local implementations that are specific to each situation. Yeah, does that make sense? Did I get most of us to nod? Yeah? Okay, that's a good outcome, all right. So thank you very much. This was a great panel.
Thank you.